On June 15, 1959, Disneyland Park celebrated its first major expansion with a television special hosted by Walt Disney himself. The star-studded event was billed as the second opening of Disneyland, a true spectacle. Among its viewers were 4 men, huddled in a small motel room in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were as impressed as they were disappointed. All of them had been at the park 4 years prior for its grand opening. All of them had played a major role in the park's development, and all 4 were now on the other side of the country, pulling 14-hour days on their own theme park project that would be less impressive and visited by less people. In that moment, all but one of them wished they were back at Disneyland. Once the special was over, they turned off the TV, cracked open some beers, and played a few rounds of poker to get their minds where their bodies already were, away from Anaheim. C.V. Wood was a hustler at best and a con man at worst. He was born on December 17, 1920 in a small town in Oklahoma, although he would often claim that he was from Texas, which he had moved to around the age of 8. His father worked for the Santa Fe Railroad during the height of the Great Depression, but Wood resented the poverty of his youth, so he rarely mentioned it. Wood would claim that he had a degree in engineering from the University of Oklahoma, but there is no proof of this, and many close to him doubted the accuracy of the claim. Despite this, Wood was able to land multiple engineering jobs just by saying he was qualified and hoping that no one checked, which they did not. Even his own name, CV, was not free of Wood's fabrications. CV stood for Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood. Some say it stood for Commodore Vanderbilt Wood, but if someone asked him, his name was C for nothing, V for nothing Wood. He preferred Woody anyways. Woody sold his mistruths and exaggerations with a cartoonish Texas accent and a showman's personality. His biggest fear in life was returning to poverty, and his greatest goal was prominence. He had learned to play life like a poker game. Woody wasn't dealt a good hand, so he learned to bluff, and no one had called him on it. Woody eventually went to work for the Stanford Research Institute, an economic development firm who in 1953 was hired by Walt and Roy Disney to help in the construction of Walt's amusement park. Harrison Buzz Price, an economist at Stanford, and Woody were tasked with finding a location for the park, as well as researching many of the logistics of operating such a business. Woody stepped into his role effortlessly. He casually chatted with landowners and leaked fake leads to the press so no one knew where Walt was intending to purchase land. He was equal parts charming and manipulative. Woody and Buzz Price also conducted possibly the most thorough assessment of amusement parks at the time, and soon C.V. Wood was a qualified expert in his field, more qualified than he had ever been as an engineer. In April 1954, with construction on the park set to begin, Roy Disney asked Wood to leave the Stanford Research Institute and join Disneyland full-time as its general manager and executive vice president. It also made him the park's first employee. He was expected to stay at least through the construction and the first year of operation. Growing up, Woody had developed a close-knit group of friends, which nicknamed themselves the Bombers, after a World War I film that they had watched. The Bombers remained friends into their adulthood, and constantly hired one another onto their projects. After obtaining his position at Disneyland, Woody did not hesitate in hiring many of his childhood friends and other acquaintances. One bomber, Earl Shelton, would become Disneyland's site manager. One of Wood's former bosses, Fred Schumacher, who had helped develop the 1939 New York World's Fair, would be brought on as a park executive. A former co-worker of Wood's, Van Arsdale France, would join Disneyland to train the park's employees. Joe Fowler, a retired Navy admiral that Wood had worked with while at SRI, was brought on to oversee the construction of the Mark Twain riverboat. It was as if Woody was planning a coup, and Walt grew suspicious of his intentions. Woody was a man that was always moving forward, climbing the ladder, and being Disneyland's general manager, there was nowhere else for him to go. Walt tended to resent the suits within his organization, as they often limited his creative visions. But Walt soon learned that Wood was on another level. He was willing to do or say anything for the sale. However, as uncomfortable as Walt was with Woody's business practices, he and Roy needed him, especially when it came to securing sponsors for the park. As construction continued, tensions between Walt and Woody rose through a series of incidents. Wood was frustrated by Walt's attention to detail with the park, believing that it was unnecessary. At one point, Wood approached Walt about a raise in the throes of construction. Walt turned him down. Disneyland was running out of funds quickly, and Walt was offended by Wood's audacity. Woody, still believing he deserved a higher pay and now feeling insulted by Walt, secretly set up a series of kickbacks with small vendors who wanted into Disneyland. On top of this, Walt would blame Woody for much of the chaos of Disneyland's opening, referred to as Black Sunday. Walt believed that the lack of crowd control and the many non-operating attractions was the fault of the park's manager. Once Disneyland was open and deemed a success, Woody, in his pursuit of fame, tried to inch himself into the spotlight. When Vice President Richard Nixon was given the key to Disneyland, Wood was the one who presented it. In November of 1955, just a few months after Disneyland's opening, Walt debuted the Mickey Mouse Club Circus just outside the park, which Wood was firmly against. After the circus failed to attract guests, Wood suggested that they make changes, which prompted Walt to respond with, quote, "God damn you, this is my circus." Roy was constantly intervening between the two, but from Wood's perspective, he often had to mediate between Walt and Roy. Perhaps Wood's most suspicious move while at Disneyland was the way in which he courted Ron Miller, Walt's son-in-law, at one point convincing Miller that Walt was irrational in his plans for the park, almost as if to draw more of the Disneyland team to his side. Walt might have felt threatened by Wood and the group of followers that he was acquiring within his own organization, fearing that he would be betrayed with Disneyland, as he had with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit and Universal, or with the strike in his own studio. Whether it was Wood's manipulation, Walt's paranoia, or a mix of both remains unclear, but the series of incidents led to Wood's firing in January of 1956. Woody was out of Disneyland, but he did not intend to leave the amusement park business. While he might have lost the hand, he was leaving with an ace up his sleeve. After his departure from Disney, Wood would form Marco Engineering Incorporated to build other theme parks throughout the United States. The design firm was ingenious, as many wealthy entrepreneurs and real estate investors were striving to copy Disneyland's success. Wood used his time at Disneyland as his main selling point, and recruited many Disneyland employees away from Walt and to Marco. The firm's first major project came in 1957, with a park to be named Magic Mountain in Golden, Colorado. Magic Mountain was planned to be an educational theme park based on Colorado history, with an Indian village and western town. There was also to be a futuristic city of Mars and a fairy tale castle, likely drawing inspiration from a source unrelated to Colorado history. The park would only be constructed partially, with many of the original plans scrapped. After Magic Mountain, Marco would design Pleasure Island in Wakefield, Massachusetts, another park with more than a few similarities to Disneyland. Some even called it the Disneyland of the Northeast. However, the park to truly hold the label, the Disneyland of the East, would be Wood's next project. Van France, who had left Disneyland to work with Wood once again, recalled finishing work on Pleasure Island's first season. Wood had already left the project to pitch a new park to New York. Wood told France to meet him in Manhattan. When he arrived at Wood's hotel room, Woody simply pointed at the table. On top of it sat a check for $13 million. With little more than his Texas charm and Disneyland on his resume, Woody had sold a theme park to the wealthy elite of New York City. The park was to be named Freedomland U.S.A. The goal of the park was to, quote, tell the whole American story in one vast area shaped like our country's map and segmented into states. Around 80 acres would be required for the U.S.-shaped park, compared to Disneyland's 60 acres. Knowing that finding that much land in the densely populated New York City would be difficult, Wood pitched the project to Webb & Knapp, a real estate firm run by famous developer William Zeckendorf, who had invested in Magic Mountain and Pleasure Island. Zeckendorf was a titan, overseeing the largest real estate empire at the time, but even he was not immune to Wood's charm. Impressively, Webb & Knapp owned an empty plot of land big enough to hold the park and then some, 205 acres of marshland in the Bronx, along the bank of the Hutchinson River. The land not used for the park would contain a parking lot for 7,200 cars and the Freedomland Inn, the park's hotel. Zeckendorf agreed to lease the swampy plot in the Bronx for Wood's park, and Freedomland had secured its land. Wood recruited investors to the project, including many of those that had invested in Pleasure Island. These investors formed a company called the International Recreation Corporation, or IRC, which would act as Freedomland's parent company. Wood's park would cost $65 million, compared to Disneyland's $17 million. This was in part because the land was expensive to lease, and because construction was more expensive in New York City. But Wood's ambitions for the park, which he saw as being a bigger, better Disneyland, also inflated the price. The $65 million figure was also likely an exaggeration for the purpose of promotion. The park was designed to entertain 90,000 visitors on peak days, and 5 million guests per year were projected. The park planned to hold a groundbreaking ceremony on July 4, 1959, but it was delayed until August 26th. In September, it was announced that Fred Schumacher, who Woody had brought on as an executive at Disneyland, would serve as Freedomland's vice president and general manager, the same roles Woody had held at Disneyland. Other Disney people included Cliff Walker, the lead designer on the Jungle Cruise, who would be the director of operations at Freedomland. Earl Shelton, Woody's childhood friend and Disneyland site manager, would be an executive at Freedomland. Van France would continue with macro engineering, training Freedomland's employees as he had done at Disneyland. And these were just a few of the many Disneyland employees that would contribute to Freedomland. By the time the park was under construction, plans for the 1964 New York World's Fair had been unveiled. The fair became a goal line for the park. The team believed that the World's Fair would draw massive crowds into New York City, and these crowds would likely spend a day at Freedomland. This belief even influenced Freedomland's advertising, with promotion for the park rolled out nationwide to familiarize the country with Freedomland before they traveled to the fair. Freedomland would miss its June 1st deadline, but would open a few weeks later, on June 19th, 1960. As with Disneyland, Freedomland's debut would be chaotic. The park's pavement was one of the last things to be finished, in a similar situation to Disneyland. At Disney's park, the heels of women's shoes sunk into the asphalt. Freedomland's situation was slightly worse, as the land beneath the park was swampland, with some sections of it having been used as a landfill. By some accounts, this led to springs from old mattresses poking their way up through the pavement and tripping visitors. Also in a parallel to Disneyland, opening day was hot, the water fountains weren't operational, and many of the attractions were roped off. Wood, who had been blamed for Disneyland's botched opening, was looking more like a common denominator rather than an innocent bystander. However, opening day did successfully draw over 60,000 people into Freedomland. New York Mayor Robert Wagner would declare June 19th Freedomland Day.
Yep, here comes the 4th Cavalry stage, right on time. Now, this may be Indian territory, and it may look like the Old West, but the time is today, and the place is Freedomland, a big entertainment park in the Bronx, in the state of New York, just half an hour by subway from Times Square in New York City.
Guests would enter Freedomland as millions had, through New York. The first theme section, named Little Old New York, was the city in the mid to late 19th century. Old New York was similar to Main Street USA in that it mainly consisted of era-specific shops and modes of transportation. The most advertised of all of the stores was certainly the replica of the first New York Macy's, which sold toys, hats, and other souvenirs. The main attraction of the land was the horseless carriage, an antique cars ride through a mock New England countryside. Aero Development, the company which had contributed many attractions to Disneyland, was responsible for the antique cars as well as numerous other Freedomland rides. As with Disneyland, Wood recruited sponsors for many of Freedomland's restaurants, shops, and attractions, packing in even more companies than he had with Disneyland. Freedomland also featured costumed actors portraying citizens of the time periods. In Little Old New York, a suffragette and a police officer would perform and interact with visitors. After the New York section was Old Chicago. Unlike the broad time period of Freedomland's New York area, Old Chicago was set at a very specific date and time. In October of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire killed around 300 people and did unfathomable damage to the city. After the fire, a reporter for the Chicago Republican newspaper claimed that the fire was started in the barn of Irish immigrant Catherine O'Leary while she was milking her cow. He claimed that the cow kicked over a lantern, which started the fire, a story that was soon published throughout the country, being accepted far and wide as the reason for the destruction, fueled by anti-poverty, anti-Irish, and anti-Catholic sentiments. 40 years later, the reporter admitted that he and two of his co-workers had made the story up. It's up for debate which is more embarrassing, that these people would ruin the reputation and life of an innocent woman to sell a few papers, or that it took 3 people to fabricate a story in which a cow kicks over a lantern. No matter, O'Leary, who reportedly, quote, died heartbroken in 1895, and the cow, who died likely oblivious at an unreported date, were cleared of all guilt. But that did not stop Freedomland U.S.A., a park boasted as, quote, authentic in every detail, for continuing to point the finger at O'Leary. In fact, visitors to Freedomland could literally point at O'Leary and her cow, as they were featured in the Old Chicago area as walk-around characters. The Chicago Fire itself was also recreated. The brochure stated, quote, "The Great Chicago Fire was a disaster. Today, it's spectacular entertainment."
Fire! Look at that!
Once every 20 minutes, a controlled fire was started on a group of buildings, and a hand-pumped fire engine was rolled out. Children were encouraged to help pump the water to put out the flames. Also in Old Chicago was the Great Lakes, a man-made waterway in which a sternwheeler and a tugboat took guests on a scenic tour. with bands on board to lead them in song. There was also a station for the park's railroad, the Santa Fe Railroad, based on the real-life railway that Wood's father had worked on. After Old Chicago was the Great Plains, set between 1803 and 1900. This area featured Fort Calvary, a log stockade straight from the, quote, Indian fightin' days. Inside, guests could learn to square dance and lasso, while also seeing bandits get caught, charged, and even attend their funeral after they were hung. An Indian village originally located in Old Chicago was eventually moved to this area as well. The major attraction of the land was the Stagecoach, which gave guests a tour of the plains and even crossed a river. After the Great Plains was San Francisco, also set in a specific year, 1906, the year of the Great Earthquake. In another disaster-turned-spectacle, the main attraction of the area would be Earthquake, a dark ride that took guests through the streets of San Francisco during the earthquake that killed over 3,000 people. Buildings crumbled, houses slid, and fires broke out as the dark ride progressed. San Francisco also had a stop for the Santa Fe Railroad. The other main attraction of the area was the Northwest Fur Trapper, Freedomland's Jungle Cruise equivalent, which took guests on a fur trapping journey along the Pacific Northwest, where they would have to avoid collapsing bridges, cougar attacks, and, quote, an ambush by totem pole Indians. By this point in the guest's Freedomland journey, some might have noticed a slight bias in the park's storytelling. While the Indian village would feature members of the Penobscot tribe as actors, the Northwest Fur Trapper ride, Fort Calvary, and the Stagecoach ride would refer to or depict indigenous people as aggressors, while depicting the pioneers as rugged heroes. This Western aesthetic was popularized decades prior by Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, and Freedomland would feature an actress portraying Annie Oakley, Buffalo Bill's famous sharpshooter. Freedomland marketed itself as edutainment, but in reality, its focus was unbridled patriotism, far more than even Disneyland presented. Freedomland was the bedroom where Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty made Yankee Doodle Dandy. It was the idea of the USA brought to life. Nowhere was this more evident than in the park's mascot, the fictional Johnny Freedom, said to be a, quote, representative of the American spirit of hard work and ingenuity. After San Francisco was the Old Southwest, set in 1890, combining three southwestern towns, Tucson, Tombstone, and Santa Fe, into one themed area. Attractions included the Tucson Mining Company Sky Ride, Casa Loca, a tilted house, mine caverns, a two-story dark ride taking guests on a journey through an old mine, and the Santa Fe Opera House and Saloon, which played Western stage shows. When the Santa Fe Railroad passed through the Old Southwest, bandits would often hold up the train. Guests could also send themselves a letter while in the Great Plains that a Pony Express rider would deliver to a post office in the Old Southwest. After the Old Southwest was New Orleans, where every day was Mardi Gras. New Orleans featured multiple dark rides, including Buccaneers, a dark ride that took guests in a ride car dressed like a pirate ship through multiple scenes of pirates and even an encounter with a sea serpent. It is suspected that one of Marco Engineering's former Disneyland employees was made aware of Walt's concept for a pirate walkthrough attraction. It is theorized that the success of Buccaneers influenced the decision to change Disneyland's walk-through Pirate Wax Museum into a dark ride. Another natural disaster dark ride, named Tornado, took guests on a car ride during a violent twister, viewing it destroy a family farm. Civil War took guests on wagons through a recreation of famous war scenes, using primitive animated figures. This was one of the park's most popular attractions, and it was partially created to capitalize off of the centennial of the Civil War, which would be celebrated from 1961 to 1965. New Orleans also featured an Aero Development Danny the Dragon ride, as well as the King Rex Carousel. The area was often referred to as Freedomland's Fantasyland equivalent. The seventh and final land of Freedomland was Satellite City, labeled as the future. The brochure stated, quote, Freedomland has taken you on a tour of America's past. In Satellite City, you can step right into its future. This space-age land was geographically located in Freedomlands, Florida, and many of the attractions were tied to the rocket launch site at Cape Canaveral. Attractions included the blast-off bunker, an educational walkthrough of a Cape Canaveral control room with a simulated launch sequence, a moving sidewalk, and the Satellite City Turnpike, a sports car kiddie ride showcasing the future of highways, similar to Disneyland's Autopia. Satellite City's most striking attraction was the Braniff Space Rover, a flight simulator that was a combination of Disneyland's Rocket to the Moon and Circarama attractions, giving guests views from above Earth, specifically of South America and the United States. The show building resembled an enormous UFO, straight from the movies of the day. The park also had its own soundtrack, with original arrangements and songs for each land. Freedomland, with its 7 themed areas and over 40 attractions, was impressive. While it clearly followed the Disneyland model, there were plenty of unique and innovative experiences that set Freedomland apart. The major difference in its scale was Wood's attention to detail. He brought the philosophy he had while at Disneyland with him to Freedomland. He believed that park guests focused on the big picture and not the tiny details. So while Freedomland was bigger than Disneyland, it lacked the depth that came from Walt's perfectionist nature and the talent of his artists. But Wood might not have been completely wrong, as many visitors who had visited both parks believed Freedomland was just as good, if not better, than Disneyland. Freedomland seemed well positioned to be a success. It had plenty of attractions, space, and promotion, but there was one major problem that the park would face. It would have to operate seasonally. Due to New York's climate and leisure habits, it was decided to operate Freedomland from June to October every year. This meant that in order to break even, Freedomland would need to attract 2 million visitors in its first season, although the team was aiming for 4.5 million. This was going to be difficult. Many, including Walt Disney himself, were not sure that East Coast audiences would be as receptive to Disneyland-type parks as the West Coast had been. It was a gamble, perhaps Wood's greatest yet, but if it were to fail, the main burden would fall to his investors. For now, though, Freedomland's future was bright. A few widely published incidents would occur in the first few months of operation. Just after opening, one of the stagecoaches overturned when the horses were spooked by the train's whistle. 10 people, including 3 children, were injured. 2 were hospitalized. On August 27th, one more robbery than planned was performed at the park, when 3 men held up the cash control center for real. They were shortly identified after one of the robbers read in the paper that they had stole a total of $28,000, when he had only received $5,000. After doing the math, he was so angry that he turned himself and the 2 others into the police. In the last few weeks of Freedomland's first season, reports began to emerge detailing financial trouble the park was facing. Apparently, even before the park opened, Wood & Company had run out of money, offering Webb and Knapp stock in the park rather than paying the rent, which Zeckendorf agreed to. The financial issues continued as the construction costs rose, and some major investors pulled out. To supplement this, Zeckendorf increased his share. Soon, Zeckendorf was a controlling shareholder, owning 40% in IRC. Zeckendorf stepped in and began operating the park, pushing out many of Wood's men, including Fred Schumacher. In the final weeks before Freedomland closed for the season, the operating schedule was changed to weekends only, leaving many weekday guests confused when they arrived at the closed park. For a quarter, they were invited to tour the non-operating grounds. October 30th, 1960 would be the final day of Freedomland's first operating season. The park had only managed to draw 1.5 million visitors, missing the necessary amount by 500,000 and falling far short of their goal for 4.5 million. By this point, Wood and Marco had moved on to their next project, a new park named Six Flags Over Texas to open in Arlington the following year. This left Zeckendorf with the keys to a failing park atop his lucrative land. The only way out that he could see was to invest more into the project. 2 live entertainment venues were added, the Hollywood Arena in the San Francisco section, and the Moon Bowl in Satellite City. However, the financial issues continued to pile up. Zeckendorf was already having a difficult time keeping a hold of Webb & Knapp's real estate empire, and Freedomland continued to be a money pit. Still, he hoped to turn it around. With the World's Fair just 3 seasons away, perhaps the park could turn a profit yet. Zeckendorf tried every trick that he knew, including restructuring assets between his companies to flow as much cash into Freedomland as possible. Ambitious plans for a Freedomland Inn were scrapped, and cheap amusements were added in an attempt to make a few quick bucks. Nothing seemed to work, and the park continued to lose money. After the 1962 season, the Tornado Dark Ride was sold to Kennywood in Pennsylvania, and other rides were put up for sale. Webb and Knapp began to auction the unused land surrounding Freedomland as Zeckendorf's empire continued to crumble. Zeckendorf tried to extend Freedomland's operating season, opening in late April for the 1963 season and even considering putting on Christmas and winter activities. These would not come to fruition. On May 16, 1964, Freedomland would open for its 5th season. As the opening approached, rumors circulated that Freedomland might be sold and moved to Florida, although park officials stated that they were optimistic about their future in New York, especially since the World's Fair had opened the previous month. In July, it was reported that Zeckendorf and Webb & Knapp had relinquished their controlling stake in the National Development Company, which had managed the land under Freedomland, as well as selling their shares in IRC. Both companies would go to Zeckendorf's long-term collaborator and president of the National Development Company, Hyman Green. Green was certain that with both the park and the land under his control, he would be able to save Freedomland, again citing the crowds coming to the New York World's Fair. However, his confidence was misplaced. On September 13, 1964, Freedomland closed its gates for the season. The next day, it filed for bankruptcy. The park was said to have been $27 million in debt. Hyman and Zeckendorf believed that they could sell a large portion of Freedomland, downsizing the theme park from its original 85 acres to a mere 30, but this never happened. Freedomland was closed forever. Most of the park's rides would be sold and relocated to other parks around the country. most notably Earthquake and Buccaneers, which would be moved to Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio, the latter being renamed to Pirate Ride. Zeckendorf would admit that Freedomland had been one of Webb and Knapp's biggest failures, coming at the worst possible time for the firm. His empire, which once had over $300 million in real estate, was no more, and Freedomland would forever be cited as one of the main reasons. There was one silver lining. The land under Freedomland was still valuable, and it would be sold to the United Housing Foundation, who on February 9, 1965, would announce their plans for the world's largest housing development, to be named Co-op City. The $300 million project would see high-rise residential buildings towering over the land on which Freedomland once stood. Co-op City still remains today, and a portion of the land is still technically zoned for amusement operations. Freedomland's quick demise left many wondering what happened. How did a park so grand fail so fast? The most glaring factors were the park's high construction costs and its seasonal operation schedule, both of which limited the park's success before opening day. However, this does not explain why Freedomland missed its attendance projections. These might have been inflated to begin with, but many speculate that Freedomland's model was already outdated by the time that it opened. The park might have been a better, bigger Disneyland, but it was a better version of the original 1955 Disneyland. By 1959, Disneyland had added 3 groundbreaking signature attractions, and amusement parks around the country began to add large thrill rides, of which Freedomland had none, which could have hurt the park's popularity. The most compelling theory to the park's demise comes from Freedomland historian and author Michael Virgintino. Virgintino tracks a series of evidence that suggests that Co-op City was planned for the park's real estate for some time, possibly even before the park was built. In a 1970 newspaper article, Zeckendorf claimed that, quote, Freedomland was a device to hold the land, and that was sound, suggesting that the park was always meant to be temporary. There remains many uncertainties, partly because Zeckendorf himself has given contradictory accounts of his involvement with the park. But there is evidence that suggests that at some point in Freedomland's lifespan, possibly even from its inception, Co-op City was planned. And if this is the case, then more than just Zeckendorf would be at fault for Freedomland's failure. A part of the blame would fall on city planner Robert Moses, who helped aid Co-op City's development as part of his housing renewal strategy for the city. The construction of Co-op City was reported to be the fulfillment of a Moses dream. Perhaps if the park had proved more profitable in its first few seasons, it could have lasted longer, but in the end, the world's largest entertainment center would last a mere 5 seasons. However, that was all the time that it needed to make a lasting impression on its guests, many of which fondly remember their trip to the country's past through the lens of Freedomland U.S.A. By this point in the late 60s, C.V. Wood was off on other ambitious projects, continuing to play the same game he always had, finding success in the most unlikely of places, in everything from chili cook-offs to African diamond mines. In 1968, he was somehow able to convince the City of London to allow him to purchase the famous London Bridge, dismantle it, and move it to Arizona, a gamble that only Woody could see through. Supposedly, Woody never felt that Freedomland was fully finished, and believed that the financial troubles early on kept it from becoming the park that he had originally envisioned. While many of Wood's business associates, such as Van France, would return to work at Disneyland, Walt and Woody never reconciled their differences. After his departure from Disneyland, their distaste for one another only grew. During the construction of Freedomland, Wood was billing himself as the master builder of Disneyland, implying to his investors that he had played a part in designing Walt's park. Walt soon learned of this and would take Wood to court over the matter, asking that he stop implying that he had a hand in designing the park. Wood would stop promoting himself as the master builder of Disneyland, at least publicly, as a result of the suit. It is rumored that this also led to Wood exiting the amusement park industry after consulting on Six Flags Over Texas. Allegedly, Walt even had a hand in the failure of Freedomland. After filing for bankruptcy, Freedomland would cite one key reason for its failure. It would not blame the expensive construction, seasonal operation schedule, or even the lack of thrill rides for its demise. It would instead blame the 1964 New York World's Fair. The very fair that the Freedomland team hoped would save the park quickly became the go-to excuse for its inability to attract crowds in its final operating season. The official reason was the fair that had been built by New York's infamous master builder, Robert Moses, and that had been populated with groundbreaking attractions by Walt Disney.